So now I'm talking and I'm like, okay, see, that's what okay, good. Got the technical thing sorted out. Everybody can hear me online, I hope too. Um, this is a joint paper with Zed Adams. A while ago, I wrote a paper where I talked about this notion of recording that I thought was very interesting. I think I didn't really understand why it was really interesting, but I tried to sort some things out. I don't think I spoke to this group about recording, so I think it's okay. I'm going to talk to you about recording because recently we were asked, Zed and I were asked to give a presentation at the APA, the American Philosophical Association, on the structure and format of representation. And we started talking about what we would do because we weren't sure what to do. And we decided we'd do a joint session where we would talk about recording because Zed is very interested in it. I'm interested in it. The concept of recording that we are worried about comes out of some work done by one of Zed's PhD advisors, John Hoagland, who I also knew. We were both Chicago grad students. This is a very Chicago sort of talk. And the organizer of that APA session was Rachel Goodman, who's also a she's also a Chicago person now working at Chicago Circle. But the APA session never happened. So because it was at the time when Omicron was running through the world and we didn't know what to expect. So we just said, how about we not go to Baltimore? And we didn't go to Baltimore. So this didn't happen. It didn't happen online either. But we kept working on it, and so it's really a work in progress. I'm not sure where we're going with it. That's partly why the handout, I usually try to do like one side of a sheet of paper for a handout, and that's why this is just sprawling, because this is what we're using to sort of work through our ideas. And so I'd love feedback on any and all aspects of this. So the goal is to introduce you to this concept of recording as we understand it, and then try to convince you that it's an interesting concept for those who are worried about pictures, and we'll see how it goes. So I will be just walking through the handout. So like if you have the handout, that's great. We have it on the screen. I will scroll as we get further along like this, and so on. Okay. So recording, this has nothing to do with representation just yet, okay? So this is just about recording. And what do we mean by recording? Well, a recording system, right, is something that's going to include at least two processes, right? One for making recordings and one for decoding them or playing them back. So one of the interesting things about the concept of recording is that it requires playback, and we'll talk about what we think that is. Now, lots of things that we do implement recording systems. Okay, so we actually build cameras, computers, these sort of phones have audio recordings, right? We can make audio recordings and play them back. So we implement recordings in many ways. That's a way of fashioning the world to make recordings within a system. That system might include, a camera and such like that. But implementations are these sort of interesting norm-governed things in a way that recording's not. Recording is a very dumb kind of thing. Recording is just about a reliable process that, as it were, encodes something out there and is such that that thing could be replicated later. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. But implementations, we make something to record something. That's a norm-governed practice. We could say this camera works as long as the temperature is below a certain threshold and above a certain threshold. It doesn't work otherwise, but recordings as we understand them are implementation independent, right? You could have many ways of implementing the same recording system because recording systems care about taking a set of features in the world and replicating those features. So at one end of the system, there's an encoding process. So one state of affairs, something going on in the world, witlessly produces another, which we'll call the recording. So you can imagine Alberto said he wanted to record this. I said, okay. So what's happening is, I'm just making noises, and then there's a very dumb system. It's very fancy and hard to build, but it's a dumb system. It's just witlessly picking up things and encoding them in this sort of digital file, which can later be played back or decoded, okay? The thing that's decoded, the decoding, the playback, is meant to be a replica in some sense of what was recorded, right? And so recording processes have three features that I think are interesting and very different from representations. Recording processes are relational, they're witless, and they allow for playback. To say that they're relational is just to say that one state of affairs is reliably related to another. The recording, a particular recording, is just a particular individual, okay? And the state of affairs you record is a particular individual. Like, this is an event. Me speaking is an event. That's a particular individual. And we're making a digital file, which is a particular individual. That file could be copied and transmitted and so on. But recording is relational in the sense that you've got to have something that you're recording, and the thing that constitutes the recording is also its own sort of individual. And to say that it's reliable is just to say that the process connecting what you record to the recording supports the relevant kinds of contrary to fact conditional. So if what I say had been different, then the recording would have been different as well, and so on, right? This relates in many interesting ways, although it might not be the same thing as what some of us call Gricean natural meaning or Dretskian information. These are both things I could talk about if you want, but they're related. To say that the recordings are witless is just to say, and this is a quote from Hoagland, that the processes involved are oblivious to content and ignorant of the world. In a way, it's basically what John had in mind was he wants recordings to be things that are specifiable exclusively in non-intentional terms, right? So it's just, these are processes in the world that have nothing to do with intention. I'll scroll down, try to scroll down a little bit here. Okay. For example, one state of affairs, the photo being thus and so is produced from another, that the scene out there, right? And that's just a dumb process. Remember, of course, it might take smart people to make helpful dumb processes, right? It's not easy to make computers or iPhones or design them, but that's about implementation, right? To say that a dumb process is helpful, I think, is that I could use it reliably without too much difficulty. So I could just use my phone and I could record things if that's what I want to do. And it produces the right kinds of recordings. And what that means is that recordings are helpful when, via a witless process, I can easily play them back, right? I can easily reproduce the replica. So there we go. Playback itself is just another witless process, okay? It's dumb. It's got no intentionality built into it. It connects the recording to another state of affairs, which is like the original in relevant respects. It's a replica. We could try to be specific about what we mean by relevant respects. I think this does all the work, and I'm surprised it does, and I love the fact that it does, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail trying to explain it. But a recording, the relevant respects, so let's say you point your camera at a scene, right? And all of you are seeing images right now, at least on the screen and whatever. You point your camera at a scene, and there are certain aspects of the scene that the camera records. And when you play back the file, you have a JPEG, and you want to look at the image, or an MP4, and you want to look at the video, you get this thing back, right? What are the things record did? I think the things that are recorded are precisely the things that you would get if I were to take the playback, right? Record it, play it back using the same system, and what would still be there on the other end of the process, right? The stuff recorded, remember, what recording does is replicate stuff. So you're making, in a sense, a copy of something. What am I copying? Well, you can tell what you're copying by trying to record the playback of the recording and seeing what you get out the other end. The way in which those things have to be the same captures the stuff that you've copied, because that's the stuff that hasn't changed from the state of the world that you've recorded to the playback of the recording and so on. I think it's lovely because that relates to something I say is true about pictures, namely a kind of transparency, but that's not what I'm talking about today. Note, and I promise I'll relate all this to pictures, but note that this means that what counts as a recording, right, and what counts as the thing recorded are actually interchangeable as far as the mechanics go. A sound pattern produced by audio speakers during playback is a recording of the magnetic pattern on the tape that it's playing back, right? Just as much as a magnetic field on the tape is the recording of the original sound pattern, right? As a practical matter, we value recordings for being stable, portable, and having all these sort of nice features. I could take my recording with me and play it back wherever I like. We value recorded things for other reasons, right? So you can't take the concert with you, but you value it because it has other features that you would like to play back later, right? And I think very little has been said in the Anglophone literature about recording. Andrew Kania has said a bit, so I reference his work here. I'm interested from you folks, actually, if any of you are familiar with work in German or Italian or French where people are focused on recording as a concept. I'd like to hear some more about that because we want this paper to be responsive to the literature as more or less as a whole, okay? And how do we understand different recording systems? Well, we just pick out different sets of properties that they replicate in playback, and that gives us different recording systems. So there's the audio recording system that my phone implements, but then there's the photography recording system that my phone implements as well, and so on. And just to clarify a couple things, the relationship between what's recorded and the playback. So we've got, this is the thing I'm recording. I make a recording and then I play it back, okay? The relationship between what's recorded and the playback is more interesting than either the relation between what's recorded and the recording or the recording and the playback, right? Because the playback is a replica of what's recorded, but the recording need not be, right? The recording can be some weird sort of JPEG file that has no interesting, obvious, engageable relationship to the thing that's recorded, right? So typically, we like replicas, and that's super interesting. The thing in the middle, generally less interesting. Note that the playback process doesn't need to, in some sense, be the inverse of the recording process, right? Playback for something like a daguerreotype, which is a recording, is just the daguerreotype sitting there manifesting a pattern of light and dark. It's very simple. Playback for a JPEG file is much more complex, right? But in neither case is the process of playing something back identical to the process of recording. These processes can be very different, but the goal is at one end, the playback, you have a replica of what you started with. Here's an interesting point, I think, and this is one interesting point that Zed and I have talked about that we think needs to be emphasized and we can make something of. Replicas, it's very important, are never the individuals recorded. They just share patterns of features, the individuals. Playback does not reproduce individuals. I can't play me back, right? You could have a process of recording me that sort of plays back certain of my features, right? You take a photo, and then there are certain features that are recorded and played back, but you can't play back particular individuals. They don't work that way. That's the point about recording. It's not a point about representation, but I think it has, we both think, Zed and I both think, it has interesting consequences for the relationship between recording and representation, and it's why we think recording is an interesting concept that isn't maybe talked about so much. And we'll come back to that bolded point there, because I think, we'll see very soon why it matters. Okay, so we have on the one hand recordings, which are relational, witless, and replayable. That's what a recording has to be. We've got representations on the other hand, which turn out to be non-relational, right? Mindful or intentional, and not necessarily replayable, right? So representation looks very different in general from recording. So why would recording be an interesting thing in relationship to representation? Well, so this is a way to think about it. All systems of representation have kind of, if you permit me to use the word, syntactic features. For present purposes, that's just properties. So like, they're properties that are responsible for a given representation in a system being the one that it is. So if you've got shapes matter for letters, grammatical organization matters for sentences, the placement of color across a surface matters for pictures. And I think in maps, placement of many properties, aside from colors layered on top of one another at different points matters for what the map is. And these are all properties, okay? Some of those systems, all systems are like that, but some of those systems exclusively represent sets of qualities. So there's semantics, right? The way we interpret them involves attributive contents. that say of something or other, perhaps, that it's thus and so. So if I say of something that it's red and square, I've attributed. That's an attributive content. I've said of a thing that it has a certain shape and a certain color. Some systems of representation just do that. So thermometers represent temperatures. That's what they do. Pictures represent, at a fundamental level, I think, patterns of color, chromatic patterns. Maps might represent topographical, political, and other features. Many of those systems are such that there's a systematic relationship between syntactic features of the representations and those features that they represent. So for example, with thermometers, a different height of the column of mercury stands for different temperatures. In maps, different colors stand for different features. In pictures, different chromatic patterns stand for different features of illumination and color and so on. When a system is like that, we want to say, and this is something I'd said in an earlier paper, and I think Zed's okay with it. But systems like this are modeled by recording processes. And what that means is just this. To the extent that the subjects of these representations exist, a recording process could generate the relevant representations. I think different kinds of depiction are all modeled by recording processes. Meaning you could set up you can imagine different ways of depicting things, such that you could set up a dumb process that captures certain features and presents, in a sense, a replica of them. Photographies, which, are probably, perhaps kinds of depiction, I think of them as implementations of recording processes that model some kinds of depiction. As a matter of implementation, different photographies involve multiple recording processes between playback and the thing recorded. This is something that Dawn Wilson, who's joining us remotely, reminds us of, and more recently, Laure Blanc-Bannon, in some work that she's doing in communication with Dawn, is also interested in. So there's a sense in which I think a lot of ways we have of representing things are implementations of recording processes. That's what photographies are. I think a lot of representations we use are modeled by recording processes, in that I could produce the range of representations in a system via a recording process. I don't think that all systems of representation, and neither does Zed, by the way. Sorry, I'm not used to co-authoring, so I have to keep in mind that it's a we here. Not all systems modeled by recording processes are inter alia recording systems, because very often representational systems care more about carrying information than about the playback stage, right? So a thermometer does not reproduce temperatures. We don't use them for that. We could use thermometers as part of a playback system if we wanted to make sure that, the temperature of this room is exactly the same as the temperature of some other room, right? A thermometer could be involved as part of a process that records temperature and then plays it back, as it were, produces the same temperature here that we had over there. But typically we don't do that, right? Photographic apparatuses reproduce color patterns, right? I mean, so that's an interesting fact that, at the end, but that's it's almost as though a photographic process has a recording phase where you get this sort of intermediary stages, and then we get a playback at the end, right? So that's true. And I think maps are a mix. Maps do reproduce spatial patterns, but they don't reproduce population densities. They might record them, because a population density is something that, in theory, you could play back. You could produce one. Not that that's easy to do, but you could, in theory, right? Being able to play the recording back is essential, however, to a representational system being modeled by a recording process. Even if the representations don't, in fact, if they don't, in fact, try to play these things back, being able to play them back is one of the things you need if the representational system is to be modeled by that kind of process, okay? Replaying a recording amounts to producing the content of the representation. But this has an interesting result that relates to the previous bolded claim on the page prior. if a representational system has parts with singular contents, okay, that representational system is not modeled by a recording process because individuals are not replayable. So if I've got a system where I can just pick out Rob or Lambert or Ava, with something like a name, right? The content there is an individual. I can't play back individuals. There is no such thing as a playback of an individual. Playbacks only work for patterns of features. So a representational system that does that is not one that's modeled by a recording process. Yes, recordings are relational, and we'll return to this point. So recordings are always relational in a way that intentional things need not be, but that doesn't mean that all recording processes or any recording processes can reproduce individuals. That's just not what they know how to do. I don't think anything knows how to reproduce individuals. That's beside the point. So what we've got is, here's what recording is like. Okay. Some representational systems look like they're modeled by recording processes, and that a recording process could produce the range of representations in a system. Even if that's not in fact what's going on, they could. Okay. Now I want to focus, so this is a thing that I did not appreciate in some earlier things I had written, and then Zed pushed me on, and I think it's really right and really helpful. So, we're interested in developing this. We think representations themselves are interesting subjects for recording. So now I'm not interested in a recording process that's recording sort of just any old thing, but I'm interested in thinking about a system of representation, okay, and all the representations you can imagine making within it. So I know if you want a list of declarative sentences in a language, if that's what you want, or something like that, or a range of photographs or whatever, I'm thinking of a system and all the different kinds of representations that are in it. And now imagining trying to record those representations, right? Not recording things generally. Rob's not a representation, so I'm not worried about recording Rob. I'm worried about recording the representations themselves, okay? These are interesting subjects for recording because artifacts generally are norm governed, right? They are what they are partly because we want them to be that way. Okay, and we'll see how this works. So, I know that, and I promise this will very much relate to pictures, but okay. Being this or that representation type usually depends on having a limited set of features, often at a limited level of detail, all of which can be recorded or played back. So, for example, just think about words, right? Token words have a limited set of features, right? There are only so many ways you could sort of scribble things and get something like a word. That I can record and play back. I can record the representation, you might think, and play it back, okay? Some representations might vary at indefinitely fine levels of detail. Okay, so some representations might in that sense be continuous. And so any process of replicating them is essentially going to be approximating them. Okay, you can't fully replicate something that varies in indefinite levels of detail. Other kinds of representations are discrete, they limit detail. Right? So they can be reproduced without a loss via a recording process. And something like copying is an intentional thing. It's an act whereby we aim to reproduce something without loss. Some kinds of representations are readily reproduced without loss, such as words and so on. Things Nelson Goodman called the syntactic sides of notational systems are reproducible without loss. Other things might not be. Okay. Yes, so I'm just looking at the time. I'm gonna skip the tape recording of a speech with the stenographer's notes. We could talk about it if people want to do that. But I do want to say that, this relates to analog and digital representations. I think that this continuous discrete distinction marks one sense of the analog digital distinction, but not the most interesting one, interpretatively speaking. And so I just want to mark that. Remember, and this is a point too that I did not, this is sort of, in a sense, Zed's good point, and he points out that Hoagland pointed this out too. Recording a representation is not the same thing as representing it, right? So I'm imagining when I'm saying representations are interesting subjects for recording, I'm imagining we've got a recording process that's recording these representations, not a representational process that's trying to represent them, okay? Even though for representational systems modeled by recording processes, representing other representations involves recording them. But that's not true for all representational systems. And so just keep that distinction in mind. Now, this is a question, because remember, recording is supposed to produce a replica. Okay. And representations, their identities only depend on maybe a small number of features, right? I'm not trying to replicate all of the features of a thing. I just want to replicate the things that are relevant to it being the representation that it is. Okay. So we can ask something like that. I think this is an interesting question. Let's say I record a representation and I play it back, so I get a replica. Does that replica have the same content as the original representation? It's a replica, after all. It should be a representation, but does it have the same content? You'd think the playbacks have to, right? They must. Recording systems produce replicas, and you haven't replicated a representation if you haven't replicated its content. That's what it is to replicate something, right? I think this holds for singular as well as attributive contents. Meaning, I think, so I said, something like a language where you've got proper names that pick out Lambert or Ava or Rob or Luca. That representational system is not modeled by a recording process, okay? But if I record those representations and make replicas of them, have I thereby preserved the fact that I've got representations with singular content on the other end? I think very often, yes. But I also think this demand for playback in a recording system shows that you can't, shows us something interesting about representations. And it's an interesting way into a set of problems that philosophers of language have talked about in different ways, because it makes it clear that we can't record all kinds of representations. Okay, we just can't do it. Like, some of them are impossible to record. So here are a few examples. First, indexical and demonstrative expressions, including descriptions when they're used demonstratively. So descriptions can be used demonstratively to pick things out. They depend on context to have the contents that they have. You can record features of those representations and preserve their context-independent meanings by doing so. But that's pretty much all you can do. If you try to record and play back representations that depend on context for their meaning, the playbacks, because they don't wind up embedded in the same context, don't have the same meanings, right? And there's an interesting, albeit small, literature. Elliot Michelson has some, Jonathan Cohen wrote a paper on this, and some others on odd ways in which indexicals work when they're recorded and played back. So the classic example is the answering machine message, "I am not here now." That's very strange, right? Okay, it's a strange thing to say, and it turns out it's true, but how could it possibly be true, and so on. Okay. So those kinds of expressions can't be recorded. Second, proper names are a mess. They're complicated. Lambert, the name Lambert, actually names many people. There are many Lamberts out there. Not out here, but out there, in the world. If proper names were uniquely held by their bearers, right? There were essentially just one Lambert, okay? They could be recorded along with their contents, right? There has to be just one Lambert right out there for that to work, because then I reproduce Lambert, and we know that the content of that name is this individual we have before us, right? But since they're not like that, or at least I can't record them as such. I think there's an interesting literature which starts with Kaplan on whether proper names are in fact unique to individuals, but we can't tell the difference between the proper names auditorially, right? But since proper names aren't like that, typically they can't be recorded. They can't be recorded with their contents, okay? So that's something we can't do. We'll talk more about that in a second. Another way of understanding all of this is that particular individuals just can't be recorded. Remember, that was the first lesson. You can't do that. You can't record particular individuals because you can't play them back. If the content of a representation depends on its being a specific instance of a type, so the type indexical where I say, you know, I am here now, right? Like, it depends on not just it being I, but the particular instance of I that happened to be uttered here and now, then I can't record that, right? I can't preserve that in something like a recording. Okay. So recordings and the playbacks don't have the same contents. And all of this, I think, holds, and this is a point that I want to, this is a point where things get confusing, I think, for lots of reasons that are relevant to pictures. All of this holds even though recording is relational. If having a specific content depends on being a particular token in a specific context, recordings can't share content, even though the recording of this representation is related to the original, literally related to the original one, but the fact is this is not that one, it's not the same one. So even though it's related, it's not reproducing its content. Okay. So what about pictures? I said I would get to pictures. Promise. I think this is all related to pictures because I think pictures, audio recordings, I think these are all of a kind representationally speaking. So I think these are all very similar. And I think what's interesting about pictures is that typically pictorial systems are modeled by recording processes. So like that's an interesting fact about them. But, okay. Pictorial systems and representations are I'm still going back and forth with Zed on this. So that's a presumptuous we. Believe they're modeled by recording processes, okay? So we expect pictures to be the kinds of representations that can be recorded. Okay, I can record them. And at a minimum, you think, well, why? Because pictures can be depicted. I can depict pictures, right? And that's a recording process, because I can always play it back and get a reproduction of the original. That I think is a reproduction of the original, right? But I think pictures can also, when they're used in different communicative contexts, they can acquire singular contents in ways similar to how proper names, definite descriptions, indexicals, and demonstratives acquire singular contents. I think we can do that with pictures. And that's, in a sense, one of the points of the book that I published now a while ago. Time is flying. In those cases, I think there's no guarantee that recordings of pictures have the same contents as the originals. Some iconographic conventions, so St. Lucy, she's the woman holding the plate with the eyes and so on, right? Some iconographic conventions are unique to this or that individual. In fact, I don't think there's another saint who holds her eyes on a plate. This is akin to an individual having something like a unique proper name. In those cases, recording representations might give you the singular contents that those representations had originally, so maybe you can record those. But generally, we can only expect the barest bones of pictorial content to be recordable. Something akin to how only part of the meaning of indexical expressions like I or demonstrative uses of the pronoun she can be recorded. You can't record all of their meaning, but you can record an aspect of their meaning. Okay. I think the most interesting place that these reflections sort of start to get some bite is when we think about photographs. And I think also maps, this is another thing I have to try to convince Zed of. Photographs are understood to represent, now this is a typical way we think about photography and photographs. They're understood to represent particular individuals because of their causal connections to a place. And so I had to snap the photo somewhere, and there's the reason for thinking that that's the individual that this photograph represents. Perhaps even locations on their surfaces, on a photographic surface, work as something like proper names. They indicate a range of locations, somewhere or other. And it's typical to say that photographs represent individuals that way. Okay. So now we're imagining recording a photograph. Not photographing it necessarily, but recording it somehow. A recording of a photograph is related to that photograph causally by a witness process. That's how recording works. Okay? By extension, it's related causally to the scene that caused the original photograph. That's easy. Similar points, by the way, would apply to proper names if, in fact, names have their contents in virtue of causal connections to things like baptisms and things like that. But photos have individual scenes as contents in virtue of being causally related to them in the right way. I'm not going to tell you what that, I'm not interested in what that right way is, but we typically say that a photograph has a particular scene as part of its content because it's related in the right way to that scene, and we try to unpack what being the right way means in terms of perhaps supporting certain kinds of counterfactuals, perhaps other kinds of things, right? Whatever that is, right? The question is, and I want to just go down a little bit on this, on the projection here. So does recording a representation, the question about photos and recording them is, does recording a photo or representation leave one with something that relates to the original scene in the right way? Right? This is interesting because I actually think in some cases it does, right? If a recording must be able to produce a replica, and recording is this sort of witless, dumb process, the features of the playback will match those of the original, and there is this counterfactual supporting sort of witless process intervening between them. But this is the point that we're struggling with, and this is something that I want to, if you have things to tell me, please do. But look, I think that what I said is that what makes the photo have a particular scene as a content is that the photo is causally related to it in the right way. Being causally related to something in the right way is not something that I can record. So it's not, so maybe the recording of the photo does have the original scene as its content, but I can't record this weird feature of it, the feature it has in virtue of being causally related to the scene in the right way. Those of you who are fond of theories of perception will recognize something of this. This is something that it's evocative of Dretske, who pointed out that one thing you can never carry information about is whether something carries information about something else. Right? So you can't really, that's a hard regularity to track because the thing in question is, the feature in question is that there's a counterfactual supporting regularity in place. And I don't know how to build a counterfactual supporting regularity to a counterfactual supporting regularity. I can't do that, okay? So photographs might be recordings, but they can't record particular individuals because such things can't be played back. But whether a photo is about a particular individual depends on its having the right causal connections. So a recording of a photo can preserve the fact about the original photo and perhaps does have the same singular content as the original, but it's a very weird, I think what this shows us, and Zed in an email just recently asked me to ask you about this too, there's something strange about the causal connection clause, and this applies to anyone who said of photographs, for example, that they give us a special perceptual access to the original scenes. For Walton, we really see your dead relatives in a timeless fashion, right, and so on. This is true of lots of other people as well. So one of the things that's confusing us is that, yes, maybe we can preserve a kind of causal connection to an original scene by recording photographs, but it's not in virtue of capturing in a recorded way the feature of being causally related in the right way to that scene. It's actually in virtue of merely instantiating the property of being causally related to that scene. So there's a way in which these sort of proper causal relations that seem to undergird these intuitions that pictures are really of particular scenes and so on, perhaps in the past, that those features are very different from most of the features we think we can record representations as having, and yet they play an interesting role in the way we understand representations, and in particular in the way we understand them as having singular contents. So this is a point at which we're sort of confused. So what are the overall lessons? Because I see that I'm going a little bit longer than I intended to go. We think, one, recording bears interesting relationships to representations that this group cares about. So pictorial representations generally, sound recordings, other things like that. We think that that's an interesting topic that hasn't gotten much discussion. One of the things we think is particularly interesting is that representations themselves can and cannot be recorded depending on the kinds of representations they are. And that the difference that matters here is whether a representation has its content in virtue of being of a certain type, which I can record, or it has its content in virtue of being the particular token of that type it happens to be, right? This is a different way to think about context dependence, I think. And finally, we think that the discussion, and so part of this paper is going to engage with the sort of Walton literature on photography. It's not just a Walton literature anymore, right? But you get the idea. Because we actually think that preserving causal connections is not something we can record, but it's something we can do. So it's something that, in a sense, escapes our ability to record it, and in a sense, escapes our ability to represent it in a way, but it's something that's really important for photographs having the special kinds of contents we think they have. And the same points would apply to audio recordings, whether you really hear me if I record myself and play myself back, and so on. So for all these reasons, we think recording's special and worth some more attention, and any input you'd have on where this could go, any other literature we should look at would be most welcome. So thank you very much.